Again, my name is Nika. I work in the Office of Civic Engagement. I'm the Assistant Director of Neighborhood Initiatives, and as most of you know, MODA and the student organization is one of my passions here on campus. Thank you everyone for coming. It's a Friday night and there's a lot going on, and it's spring and it's warm out, so thank you for coming and taking a look at our garments. I want to take this opportunity to thank the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Conrad Hamather, Dr. Massey, and all the graduate students that provided our students with the opportunity to work with them and to have this mentorship program. I think from talking to all of our students, it's been an incredible experience, and I can't thank you enough for making that happen. And I think it was definitely invaluable, and we hope to do a lot of this in the future. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to acknowledge the fact that the hard work that our students put in outside of their academic or rigorous work. A lot of our students are seniors, and the fact that they take the time to do this outside of class is incredible. And I enjoy, and I know that a lot of our staff, faculty, and students enjoy your work, your runway show, and your garments downstairs. So I applaud you for this, and I encourage you to continue to pursue your passions. Again, I want to thank Conrad, and I want to thank SAIC for giving this opportunity. And last but not least, I want to thank our panelists for taking the time out of their day and out of their incredibly rigorous work to have this conversation with us, to talk about how do we approach fashion from the research perspective here at the University of Chicago, and how we do this as faculty, as staff, and as students, and what we do. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Camille Morgan. Camille is the exhibition curatorial coordinator here at the Logan Center. She is also the guest curator for the Ebony Fashion Fair show at the Milwaukee Art Museum. So she comes incredibly to us with a wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge, and her own passion into this conversation. And I'll let her introduce the rest of our panelists. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy tonight.
Thank you, Nika. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here, and I'm glad you guys are here because that means there is some interest in learning about fashion at the University of Chicago and in academia and what that means and where that can go. So I'm actually going to have the panelists introduce themselves briefly, and then I'll give a little quote about fashion and academia, and we'll get into the discussion.
So I'm Jen Cohen, and I am a 7th year graduate student in the Department of Art History here at the University of Chicago. And I've been asked to be on this panel because I have a background in fashion, and I've done a master's in apparel design and textiles, and I have sort of a previous life in teaching costume history and textiles and apparel design and sewing at the university level at WVU. So I think that covers it for now. I can tell you more about my dissertation sort of in the questions.
Hi, I'm Tim Campbell. I teach in the English department here at the University of Chicago, and that's my primary intellectual training and orientation and background. So I came to fashion somewhat haphazardly in the course of doing my research and realizing there wasn't really a good way to think about fashion in any one discipline. So I think that's one of the big exciting challenges that fashion poses to the normal way we do things at the university. Here at Chicago, I teach regularly a master's level course called Fashion and Change on the history and theory of fashion, so sort of Renaissance to the 20th century. And I'm just finishing a book called Historical Style, where I'm thinking about 18th century and Romantic British literature, but also about the profound ways in which early fashion cycles and the early fashion system shape people's feeling about history, people's understanding of the way history works. So one of the things that happens in this moment, fashion cycles emerge, a fashion system emerges, but also the historical novel emerges, and that's one of the problems I think about. The 18th century moment I study is also the one, for the first time you get fashion plates that come out every year. It's called the Dress of the Year. So something like our modern magazine periodical culture of regularly issued fashion arises, and that's one of the interesting problems that people in the 18th century are already thinking about. What does it mean that things change every year? So that's something I think about in my work. I'm also interested in the ways, thinking about fashion historically, there's a big problem because a lot of this dress doesn't survive. So what do we do? You need all kinds of other ways of thinking about this material. You need to think about texts, you need to think about literary evidence, you need to think about illustrations and anything else you can get because, you know, with some exceptions, especially ordinary people's dress just doesn't survive. So it's a really wonderful problem. We want to know about this material culture that in many ways isn't around anymore. Just a little illustration of something I do. So the first historical novelist in British literature is Walter Scott. But you can also think of Scott as the guy who makes Scottish tartan a world historical textile. One and the same guy. He's like the Harry Potter, his historical novels are something like Harry Potter to that moment. He outsells all the other novelists of his moment combined. This same guy is the guy who decides that every clan in Scotland is going to have its own tartan pattern and all this other kind of stuff. And so whenever you see Scottish tartan plaid anywhere in the world, Walter Scott in a literary story has something to do with this, right? Kind of crazy. So these are the things I think about.
I'm Harrison Yu. I'm a fourth-year political science major. I'm part of the MODA executive board, and I also help run the designer bootcamp program. This is my third year doing that. I started designing my first year, so my fourth year designing. So it's been a wild transformation from my first year to fourth year. Looking back at my designs, it's kind of, oh, I see what I've done in the past, and kind of looking out like, wow, I can't believe I've done this. And then so the designer bootcamp program is really great. We take 6 to 9 students each year. We train them from the ground up. They have zero sewing experience, and we really try to train them for 22 weeks, kind of start from 0 to 60 or to 100, and really churn something out for the MODA fashion show every spring quarter. So that's been a really, really great experience and really has gotten me on the hands-on kind of management and also creative side at MODA.
I just want to read a brief excerpt from one of my favorite academic fashion blogs called Threadbared. I'm not sure if who here has ever heard of Threadbared? Oh, okay. No one on stage? Okay, well, you guys are going to have to check it out. So it's called Mind Over Malls, or Does Academia Hate Fashion? Once upon a time in 1997, feminist literary critic and Princeton English professor Elaine Showalter wrote an article for Vogue magazine disclosing her love of shopping malls, lipstick colors, literary makeovers, and fashion catalogs. The magazine editors gave it the cleverly alliterative title, The Professor Wore Prada. For this admission, Showalter was pilloried by grad students and colleagues alike on the Modern Language Association's electronic discussion list. They contemptuously remarked that surely she must have better things to do than to write for these magazines, fashion magazines, all while insisting that they had better things to do than read them, and would not have even read her article, except in the line of feminist theoretical duty. 10 years later, in a New York Times article about why people love to hate fashion, Showalter seemed to be alluding to the previous Mind Over Malls dust-up when she tells fashion journalist Guy Trabay, particularly in academia, where bodies are just carts for hauling around brains, the thrill and social play and complex masquerade of fashion is very much denigrated. So does academia still hate fashion? Today there are national and international academic blogs, monographs, essay collections, academic courses, and conferences devoted to the critical interrogation of diverse spheres and articles of fashion, their culture and social politics, their histories, the psychology of fashion and adornment, as well as their many entangled circuits of consumption, exchange, and production. Along with these institutionalized sites of fashion and consumerism scholarship, there is an informal and smaller sphere of fashion discourse happening in style blogs for and about academics. Geek chic style blogs comprise a tiny subset of a massive field of online fashion reportage that began around 2001. And yet, despite the breadth of fashion scholarship, which we have here on the stage, and emergence of academic fashion and style blogs, the writers of this blog say that they're not so sure that academia has reformed its surly attitude towards fashion. So just briefly to give you some information about MODA numbers and just how many people are actually involved, The president of MODA, Morgan, thankfully gave me some of this information. So in total, 117 students directly participated in MODA's programs this year, not including attendees of events, models, or volunteers. On the MODA board, we have 17 students. For the MODA magazine, we have 60 students managing that. And for the MODA blog, we have 20 students. And for this school year, we had 20 designers for MODA. And the attendance at the spring fashion show, does anyone want to guess how many people came to the fashion show this year? Yell out some numbers. 100? Thank you, Nika. What'd you say? 500. Nope, more. Close. Getting close. Higher. Getting warmer? Yes. 1,400 people, 1,400 people came to see the MODA show this year at Chicago's Union Station. If anyone's ever been in the Great Hall, it's beautiful. It's a wonderful, gorgeous venue, and as you saw in the videos, it really showcased the talent of these students that are sometimes political science majors or whatever. So, okay, now I have to turn my. So what we're seeing here are images from the show, background images, and things like that. So that'll just keep cycling through. So panelists, now I'm going to talk to you guys. I want to start out with just like a general question that as members of University of Chicago, what does fashion mean to you? Anyone can start.
I mean, fashion at UChicago, I think, has changed a lot since I came to this university. I think UChicago's fashion aesthetic could be described somewhat like hipster chic, maybe. That's
chic?
Yeah. We're ahead of our time, aren't we? No, fashion I think is becoming increasingly important at UChicago. Whenever I tell someone, "Oh, I'm on MODA," they go, "Oh, wow, it's that big nebulous thing." I said, "No, I also design for MODA," and they go, "Oh, wow, you actually make things." I said, "Yeah, I just don't need to use my brain. I can also use my hands too," which is very, very, I think, unique and something that's very, very exciting on campus for students.
What I'd say about fashion at UChicago isn't necessarily so specific to UChicago, but it's like this. One thing I always tell our faculty is this subterranean thing that is MODA. Like there's 1,000, 1,200, 1,400 kids that show up every year for this fashion show. This is going on right under your nose, and you have no idea what's going on. And so one of the things that I do think about fashion is that part of the excitement is it's not part of the mainstream of academic culture, and it gets to be something different. I'm not a student, so you, Harrison, can tell me if I'm wrong about that. But also for me, somewhat more selfishly, it's always that thing that challenges academic disciplines and paradigms, and it doesn't belong neatly anywhere. It's not art history, it's not consumer culture, it's not just the history of literature and writing about fashion or prose and fashion magazines. Is fashion aesthetic? Is it business? What is it? It kind of shatters people's normal ways of dividing up the world. And that's what's exciting to me about it. But in that sense, I guess it is true to the spirit of University of Chicago, or it should be more, because that's kind of what we are academically, as people who think in interdisciplinary ways and don't take for granted the normal ways of dividing up the intellectual academic world. So,
yeah, along the same lines, I think with the quote that you introduced, for me, fashion is really double-sided, because it's not only this kind of beautiful imagery and kind of world you want to live in, but it's also a way for me to introduce tension within my field, and kind of a way to critique dominant norms of discussion and discourse.
What do you mean when you say tension?
I guess, well, I have experienced tension with my my sort of advisors about a way to talk about fashion in my work, but it's also, I think, because fashion introduces something within academia that's really difficult to talk about, which is that our ideas and our kind of norms and histories of our intellectual histories are subject to historical cycles, and so I think that I think that fashion, while being very attractive and beautiful at times, is also a way to introduce a little bit of kind of tug of war.
Oh yeah,
in a field.
definitely.
Yeah.
That hits close to home. There are intellectual tastemakers at the University of Chicago. When you think too hard about what fashion is, intellectual life starts to look a little bit unsettlingly like that.
Intellectual tastemakers. What? Tell me more about this. What is? I'm kind of new to the University of Chicago. I started here in October, so I'm
I mean,
curious.
it's tastemakers makes it sound bad, but that's what you say. You say tastemakers is bad and something else is good, right? People are always trying to decide, you know, what's going to be the thing that not just one faculty member, but several faculty members can collaborate on. What is this area where there's a kind of thread that's connecting a bunch of different things together, right? And you know, you could call that, you know, cutting edge, exploratory, interdisciplinary thinking, but it's also like a bunch of people who have kind of decided what the hot thing to do is now. And so there's something organic about that, but there's something about people deciding they're going to work on this thing rather than other things. That
Yeah, definitely. Just FYI, you know you're sharing that with Harrison, so just like look over at him sometimes. Since I have to have my own microphone. Well, in order to prepare for this panel discussion, we actually had a little phone conversation earlier this week, and we're talking about some things, and it was so weird because we couldn't see each other, and we're like, who talks next? But someone mentioned, I don't know if it was you, Tim, about this object cultures project on campus, and that sounds like a way to bring in ideas of material culture and fashion in a way. But you said there was some pushback against talking about fashion in that respect.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily pushback, but the object cultures project, the challenge there is to think really hard about the material objects that are right there in front of us and all of their strangeness as material objects. So you can think about this as Bill Brown, one of our English faculty members, does. Is you notice an object's thingness when it's broken, when it's not doing the things it's supposed to do. Then you sort of attend to it in its particularity and what it is in front of you, rather than the thing you use it for or all those other ways you normally make sense of it. Fashion is that, and it's not that, because fashion makes you attend, maybe like nothing else does, to the fine-grained material texture of an object, to fabrics, textiles, that kind of thing. And then in another sense, if you're looking at an object in terms of its fashionability, you really care about it to the extent that it adheres to some aesthetic norm or value or some aesthetic trend or something like that. So you're really not valuing it as the object in front of you. And yet, different things come and go in fashion, and you start to see new facets of material objects. So you kind of return to that material object again and again. So it's, again, fashion is introducing tension to that paradigm, even of a new paradigm like object cultures, material cultural studies.
I wanted to actually go back to Harrison, being a student here in, you said political science, right? How does working with fashion or making help you in your studies in political science, or does it help you at all?
Yeah, I mean, most people think that these two are very separate from each other. They're not. Fashion is something very creative, and if you're to be a successful student, you also have to approach problems very creatively as well. So I think being able to problem solve and to approach things in different ways when creating dresses and such help me approach different problems when you're approaching kind of maybe international relations theory. You're going, how am I going to change this? Oh, I'm going to look at it from a different perspective. The same thing when you're looking at a dress. You're kind of looking at the front. You go, oh, this is nice, but what does it look like from the back? And so, oh, it looks kind of weird. Let me reshape it so it looks good on all angles. And so that's kind of influenced the way I've approached academics as well, to really tighten up and look around at everything.
How about you, Jen? In your in art history, yeah, like in studying that.
It's so many different ways. I mean, I think on our phone call, I was talking about how being a designer, it gives you this really, really keen aesthetic sense that I think is invaluable if you're trying to look at any image. And also, I was talking about the way in which it helped me organize my dissertation, and in a way that I found to be both a superpower and sort of aesthetic way of organizing my objects that elicits different arguments, but also a problem in that it's over-aestheticized in a certain way. But fashion has really opened up for me a way to think about value in art history, and in my dissertation in particular, I was so interested. I think as an undergraduate, I studied comparative literature, and I studied the work of Garcia Lorca, which got me into Dali and their sort of intellectual correspondence. I was so interested in the way that Dali's fashion design presented a real problem for surrealism, at the same time that surrealist imagery had seemed to be so easily appropriated by
How did it present a
fashion.
problem? How did I didn't know about that.
A political problem, but no, good question. In that it was too easily, that surrealist ideas, it exposed them suddenly as being so easily bought and sold. And I think that
Putting a price, like a
on revolution,
value.
on really
Okay.
on revolutionary change.
Yeah.
So just looking at the sort of success of surrealist imagery and fashion and marketing more generally, it really caused me to want to interrogate what is it in the surrealist movement that that is both entranced by fashion and excited by consumption as maybe an artistic technique, if you think about the found object as a quintessential surrealist artistic technique. But that's also presents a real anxiety, and you see this in sort of the rhetoric that Andre Breton, the leader of surrealism's rhetoric about expelling people who are too easily selling their work, for instance. So that has become basically the heart of my dissertation, and I look at it in a bunch of different media, from installation to postcards, and the way that surrealist objects are sort of exchanged in the world. So and shop windows.
Oh, yeah.
So fashion comes into it sort of obliquely, but it underlies it.
And we had mentioned before, like Dali's collaboration with Schiaparelli, Elsa Schiaparelli, who was a famous fashion designer in like the 30s and 40s throughout there. Do you know anything about that? Like, what was that? I mean, since this is your study, like, do you have any background information for us about that collaboration?
Well,
about that connection?
For me, it's just been sort of a collaborations with fashion design have become they've been discussed. So I take that as a given. I take so this is the 30s and around the Spanish Civil War. So this is where the problems come out. That they work on this collection together, the 30s, and it's sort of, from a fashion perspective, maybe the fashion designers know about this. Not a very innovative fashion design, sort of an applied surrealist design, but looking back from the very beginning of the surrealist movement, we see collaboration with fashion, and Andre Breton, this influential surrealist leader, being basically the art librarian for Jacques Doucet, the fashion designer. So these I take for granted. I'm not too interested in reinventing the wheel here, but so it's more. My evidence is more sort of the discourse surrounding surrealism, and looking for ways that a consumerist attitude is just endemic in the very. It's knit into the most revolutionary surrealist ideas.
Yeah, I really like how you're touching on the idea of value and fashion, and what does that mean culturally, economically, and all these different ways. In my work at the Milwaukee Art Museum on the Inspiring Beauty show for Ebony Fashion Fair, I was always struck by, so I give a lot of tours for this show, and part of the story is that Eunice Johnson, who is the director and producer of the Ebony Fashion Fair, which ran for 50 years and showed haute couture fashions on all across the United States, basically for just regular people to see. When she first went to the European fashion houses to purchase these designs, these haute couture designs, the designers did not want to sell to her. And I'm thinking about like economics and the history of that here at the University of Chicago, and how that does not make sense in economic theory. I'm not an economist at all. I do listen to Freakonomics podcast like every day, but I'm not an economist, but it didn't make any economic sense that they didn't want to sell to her because she was brown or black. They were selling clothes, and at the end of the day, they did change their mind because there is so much, concepts of capitalism and money making in the fashion industry. It's like a $1 billion a year industry. But when you place it in the oeuvre of art, like for instance, in art history here, I doubt, do you know, I don't know, do they teach fashion at all in any art history here? Would you know?
No.
Are there any art history people in the audience? Do they teach fashion history? So fashion does come up in design? Okay, that's really interesting. Because there's like...
I mean, we bring it.
Yeah.
I think, we were brought in, both Victoria and I were brought in as grad students 7 years ago because there was some knowledge on the part of our advisor, this one person in art history, that fashion was important. And that was something she wanted to bring on. So, but it's something that is really just growing, I think, with our generation. And
Don't graduate.
yeah, well, do
Stay
graduate
here.
and hopefully get jobs.
Yeah, do graduate actually and come back. Well, that makes me, just before we open it up to like some questions and comments and things like that, in talking about fashion, we see it here at UChicago in MODA. So that's a student-driven, student-run organization. So that's kind of like coming from the ground up. And within that, we see fashion show production. I mean, this is huge event production that they're doing here as students. So getting funding and sponsorship and getting students involved, creating this connection with the School of the Art Institute, which I've never, ever heard of students being able to take a course for free at an art school. And we know the Art Institute is one of the most expensive art schools in the country, in the United States today. So between that, we have some art history connections, a little bit English, political science. Oh, before we get to the question I was going to ask, what do your colleagues and friends and whatever, what is their reaction when you talk about teaching these courses or studying fashion within art history or working, creating designs in political science? Do they ask you to make stuff for them, or are they interested, or are they like, oh, that's lame?
Yeah, well, actually, people are really, really interested whenever I tell them. I was like, whenever I'm doing like banking interviews or consulting interviews, I say, what do you do in your free time? I said, oh, well, I do fashion. What do you mean do fashion? I was like, oh, well, I design, I construct garments. Oh, wow, that's really cool. What are you doing here? I said, well, I want to explore a lot of different things. And then they start launching into this big conversation. Wow, I really liked fashion in high school growing up, and kind of, oh, I really want to pursue this. You should just do that. What are you doing here? Just go. Like, wow, okay. But just in general, it's a really good way. Everyone's very, very interested, and people are very, very curious on how to get more involved, which is really encouraging and very exciting to see. Hopefully, we'll see UChicago maybe have a fashion major in the future. I don't know, but
Let's not get crazy.
hopefully. But no, it's a very unique experience. I think among all of my friends, anyone I've talked to on the East and West Coast, I think UChicago is one of the only instances where a student can pursue fashion as much or as little as he or she wants. Without being actually in that discipline, and still churn out something that is wearable, something that's palatable, and something that can end up on a runway like that. So I think this is a very unique and very exciting, very, very great experience I would have never had I not come to UChicago.
Well, that's awesome. And how about you, Tim? You're teaching this course. I know it's important when you're faculty, you want to fill your class so you can continue it. That's dollars in your pocket. You know what I'm saying? So like, what does this class about fashion, it fills up, you told me?
Well, yes, people are interested to take the fashion class. It's true. So that's nice. It's nice, but it's also fun for me because lots of different kinds of people are interested in taking this class. So it's not just the usual suspects of people who are interested in 18th century Romantic English literature, people from around the university. And I have to say, my colleagues are very thrilled to have me do fashion. I mean, they knew I did fashion stuff before they hired me. I didn't just surprise them when I got here. But, I kind of go do fashion on the side. I teach this class that's really about fashion on the side, and it's not quite at the core of the department. But our department is a really hospitable place for letting people do that kind of thing. And yet it's not exactly like we're collaborating
Yeah.
on our thinking about fashion. So yeah.
Okay. And Jen, your colleagues, your peers here, what's
I
their
have a
impression?
wonderful colleague, Victoria, who we talk about fashion a lot, do little reading groups and things like that. It varies, you know. When I was an undergrad, interested in fashion, doing things very much like Harrison, I was told by graduate students, do not go to grad school, just make things. You'll be so much happier. So there's that. And then, you know, family just that they ask for repairs a lot.
Oh, okay.
But
That's a useful skill.
yeah, so
you know?
so it really varies. You know, people like Michael and really great intellectual colleagues in fashion, but it is one of these things where it's like I was saying, it's double-sided. So you can say you're interested in fashion, and people will mistake you to mean that you like to shop a lot,
Which could be true.
right?
I mean,
And you can like it in very contradictory ways.
yeah, right.
So, yeah, it's
Oh, interesting. Well, I want to just keep us in the framework or in the mindset of thinking about what, you know, after this panel discussion, after this exhibition, is this something we want to do again? Is this something we want to see in other places coming up, you know, at the University of Chicago? So I want to open up to the audience to see what you think about that. If you have any comments or questions for us as panelists here. Yes, Nika.
I wanted to hear Harrison and ask what his favorite thing about the mentorship at SAIC, his experience at SAIC, because it's so different than the University of Chicago, and I just wanted to hear about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was hoping to speak about that tonight, but the SAIC partnership was amazing, truly amazing. I would not have been able to create anything after, well, basically I told myself my third year, I think I'm done, I think I'm spent. But after doing this program, it was really unique because we approached it from a complete design aspect, really starting from square zero, from square one, or even square zero. It was very interesting to really integrate sights, sounds, smells, feels, objects, concepts, ideas, and being able to create something from that. What I've taught, what I've learned, and what I've tried to teach my other DBC kids was not the right way. We was basically whatever you think looks good, maybe modify that a little bit. It's yours then, and obviously then you get kind of uninspired ideas. But it's good for UChicago standards. But by going into the SAIC program though, it's really opened my eyes a lot. And I've this year with my newest DBC class, while I was learning, I was simultaneously teaching my kids. All right, this is what I've learned yesterday. This is what you're going to do today. So it was really exciting to be able to really understand how a true, I guess, fashion graduate student actually thinks, how the process actually is, and to try and adapt that in my very short amount of time here.
You know, just to play off your question, Nika, for you, Harrison, how did the students at the School of the Art Institute that you interacted with them too, right? Did they think about fashion or making differently than where you were coming from? Like, did you see any differences and similarities? Because they're like a whole art school, like it's quite different.
Yeah, I think it's because they eat, sleep, live, and breathe fashion.
They probably don't sleep at all.
Something that we have in common. But it's very. I think it's a very different perspective. Yes, because they're so entrenched in fashion, they manage to take fashion, make it more theoretical, more academic, and more, I think, focused. Whereas for us, it's kind of, we have this deadline, March 6, 2015. Let's churn out a collection, and it's basically from start to finish there. And so I think that time crunch and that kind of the desire to churn out a final product rather than kind of the actual process is a very different perspective from UChicago versus SAIC.
Right, so that aspect of time, I think, is Celia in the audience? I remember we were installing the show downstairs. Celia has 3 pieces, and we were just talking about just having more time to just focus and make mistakes and try different things and be very experimental. I mean, we all need to just be able to buy time, don't we? Time. Ugh. Well, speaking of time, do we have any more questions or comments? Yes, right there.
It's kind of an elementary question, but I'm just really curious to hear your answers on it. As you mentioned the time element, you only use the word fashion, and do you what does that mean? Do you mean accelerated obsolescence, capitalist mode kind of clothing? Or do you consider fashion just I'm throwing out my own thoughts because I have not hammered out the definitions after decades of this, but, are you encompassing clothing in that? In a lot of serious collections insist on using words like costume, which is also misleading because that means two things, or dress, which is misleading because that means two things. So what do you mean by fashion and individually? I'm not sure there is a right answer, but, and then do you think it's important to differentiate between different types of things, like garments that are not part of a planned obsolescence? I think you get the gist of my not clear question.
Well, I'm interested in fashion specifically as that thing which changes regularly, and I think I'm kind of allowed to cheat because I have this wonderful archive that I study, which is the dress of the year every year, and I have all these people who find an old picture of the dress of the year, and therefore they can go back to exactly that year. I think it gets more complicated in the second half of the 20th century too, so I have it a little easier for myself that there is something that's really more genuinely changing at the same time for me. But I guess I'd also say, like, one of the things that most interests me about fashion as something that changes all the time is you have an ongoing record of our subconscious, like a visual, aesthetic, and despite ourselves, it's there, even when it's not in the forefront of our consciousness, or even when it's not the kind of thing we would write down in a literary text. So that aspect of dress that is changing is particularly interesting to me, although you're right to point to the ways in which that doesn't exhaust dress. But I've been excited too, like there's recent work in the history of fashion and dress in the 18th century that's discovering the ways in which even poor people, the working poor in 18th century England, actually followed fashion in their dress. They did it in small ways and in modified ways, kind of like the way, you might buy some couture accessory because you can't afford the real thing. But in small ways, a handkerchief. You could buy something that was, in the pattern that was in fashion that year and the color that was in fashion that year. So there are ways in which the constant change of it extends more broadly than we sometimes think in our everyday way of thinking about fashion.
Yeah, I do think it's incredibly important to distinguish between this terminology. And in my work, specifically my dissertation, I'm interested in fashion as this definitely accelerated historical change. And this is what gives me access to a kind of different perspective on the historical avant-garde and sort of the interest in the ever-changing new in art. So my interest in fashion does not necessarily touch upon clothing in my dissertation, although sometimes it kind of veers off into it, whether it's in the fashion window or the odd surrealist interest in like the glove or something like that. But yeah, I definitely, in my teaching, in the past, the difference between apparel and costume and dress, and it's really important. And I think this is where some of the confusion comes in when you talk about fashion, because people assume you're just interested in clothes. And sometimes, I am very interested in clothes, but not necessarily always as fashion. So I hope that answers your question.
For me, it's well, I don't have the academic background that my two panelists have, but for me, I've always been thinking fashion is very interesting in that you have two sides of fashion. You have the business side of fashion, and you have the perception of what fashion is. And for the consumer, fashion is, oh, this is an expression of who I am. This is an extension of my personality that people can see before I even start speaking to them. Whereas the business side is kind of let's churn out something that everyone else wants to wear, and this is the hot new trend. And you see Zara and H&M kind of taking everything right off the runway and shipping it off a week later, which is, for me, it's a very interesting concept that people think that there's still individuals, yet most fashion is mass market. So you're still buying something, and obviously 10 people in the world, at least 10 people are wearing the same exact shirt that you are, and yet you're still taking that as your identity. And when everyone's saying that everyone is unique, you're saying, oh, well, that's true, but at the same time, there's also 10 other people like me. So it's kind of that, for me, there's that interesting play between that, the hard, cold rationality of the business, and also the kind of creative, kind of emotional side of it.
That's a fascinating question. These are all fascinating responses. For me, fashion, dress, textiles, costume is everything. I think it's power. I think it can bring you to your knees. I think you can walk into a room and people can have this idea of who you are just because of what you wear and what you project through it. I think it's a way to study economics, philosophy, phenomenology, sociology, and I love a great sale. I go to Nordstrom Rack like every other day. You know what I'm saying? For me, there's no like, oh, this is the good side of fashion or how we should talk about it, or this is the bad side. In working with the Milwaukee Art Museum for this show, I oftentimes say costume because my background is in the history of textiles and dress, and we discuss things that someone's not physically wearing at the moment as costumes. So it can be difficult for people because they think, oh, you're denigrating that. What we're looking at in front of us is like when you think of a costume, like a uniform or something like that. But I think that's also part of it. So for me, there is no delineation. The artists are, Valentino, Oscar de la Renta, Stephen Burroughs. They are, in my head, true artists, and I use that in contemporary art to explore other ideas. And there are a lot of fine artists, contemporary artists that maybe, did study fashion design in undergrad and then went on to get an MFA or whatever. So I see it in everything. I see it in everything. It's everything to me. And I love shopping. I love all of it. And I love the terrible parts of it too, because it explores issues of ethics, and there are a lot of terrible conditions people are working in, dying in, creating the clothes we're wearing up here. I think it's interesting that you're all in very dark colors today. I noticed at University of Chicago in the Logan Center, everyone wears gray and black, and which is still awesome. Very great fashion colors. But I think, yeah, you can give a lot away by putting something on that morning. People are gonna, you can change every day with it, Any other questions or comments? Yeah, in the back.
I have a question that I think would be interesting, of course, even here at UC, not only at your school, but the psychology of fashion. Like what the fashion of a certain year or time says about that time. And what the values people are, what it says about human nature.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that people want to look different from year to year, but they want to look like other people they know? Like there was this cartoon in the New York Times or the New Yorker where all the girls were dressed alike. They said, can you believe they complained for 12 years because they had to wear uniforms? But it does say so much. Like when you see Mad Men End, how much the fashion of that time said about that time. It would be an interesting course.
Oh, like here at the University of Chicago. That would be an interesting course. I would definitely sign up for that.
Well, it's a great question. This is something that different fashion historians and critics fight about. Some of them want to say that you're exactly right. Like we can go look at fashions and we'll know exactly what people were feeling and doing and thinking at a time. And then another fashion critic will say, well, actually, if you look at the procession of hemlines of dresses, they're going to march in absolutely arithmetic, mathematical regularity up and down because there's a bigger structure that's really shaping fashion. And so the up-close view, people think that fashion is telling you about their psychology and their personality and their individuality, but really there are larger forces at play, larger forces at work. So it's a great question, and it's one like people who think about this all the time don't have a good answer for all the time, and they still fight about.
I always wondered why hemlines went down during the Depression while they were up in the 20s, because they had to use more fabric.
Yeah, the skirts were, they were at their shirts, I think in 1925. I mean, it's hard to come up with any one definition when you are talking about fashion. I mean, unless you're pinpointing a specific like time and place and socioeconomic group, the same trends that you see happening in wealthier classes aren't necessarily going to be happening in those same classes in a different country, like England versus the U.S. The U.S. was always a bit behind until like the late 20th, mid 20th century. We were always behind a bit. But I don't know where I was going with this. Anyone want to chime in on anything? No. But yeah, no, I like thinking about the psychology of fashion. I mean, and it has, I mean, look, thinking about being here at the University of Chicago with the medical science research going on here, I mean, there are people that are on, you know, the autism spectrum, and their sense of touch is quite different than other people's sense of touch. Some of them, like Temple Grandin, if anyone's ever heard of her, she's a famous, I don't know what, she studies like animal husbandry, and she's written books about autism and her experience working and connecting to animals and the way they think. And for her, like, she wears kind of like the same thing every day, but there are aspects that are related between like humans and animals, where the idea of like pressure calms you down, and that relates to the way that, you know, your own sense of your neuroscience in your body and your sensory receptors and your memory. And I think it oftentimes relates to why we hold on to clothes we no longer wear. Everyone has something in their closet they never wear, and there's always a different reason for that. And I think that touches upon different psychological ideas. I mean, there's a wealth of topics that could be here at the University of Chicago, which we always want to get back to. We have time for about one more question or comment before we end the evening. Anyone have anything? Morgan.
As one of the co-presidents of MODA, we always try to be receptive to our community as a student organization. We want to think about fashion in ways that are interesting to the people here. And I guess my question for the panelists would be, if you could see fashion grow or expand in a certain way on campus, what would that be? Where do you see fashion growing here?
It's a great question. Who wants to start?
I think Tim's class is a great start. Yeah, I'm not sure that I would institute sort of a fashion department, as Harrison has suggested. But I like this. So, you know, I have my corner in art history. We have a corner in lit. There's a fashion historian and Germanist, Barbara Vinken, who was able to come and visit and give a course here on fashion and modernity recently. I like that's going on. I do wish that there was some kind of, you know, sometimes we don't know when, so I'm not sure what Tim is doing, and he's not sure what I'm doing, and Barbara Vinken's class wasn't well advertised, so maybe some kind of structure in place to make sure that these things are known about and sort of attended in a serious way. I have never been to one of these fashion shows, so you know, I would love maybe more communication, and I love this program with SAIC. This is just yet more, I think, communication between people who are interested in fashion and people who are making it, which is such a different thing, to have your hands on fabric and actually cutting and sewing. And so I think just more talking, maybe a colloquium would be good. What do you think?
Well, that all sounds great too. And I would just say, as a professor thinking about students and what's exciting to me about MODA shows, I think, and this is partly what I value in my aesthetic of fashion, but like ideas in dress, like dresses that kind of speak an idea really strongly, are easy to latch onto, and the more traditional academic ways of chewing things up. And so actually I think Harrison's designs are a really great example. And I don't want to ruin MODA by making it all academic. That would be a worry, because part of like the fun of that is the enthusiasm and all kinds of people who don't see it, who see it as a compliment or see it as a kind of departure from their ordinary academic work. But for more occasions where like designers can talk about the ideas that drive their designs, I think that stuff's really exciting, and that's the kind of thing that could communicate the energy of MODA to a wider constituency of faculty around campus.
Well, for me, it's kind of going along with one of UChicago's big pushes right now is actually to focus on entrepreneurship, and we have the new CIE up on 53rd Street, and that's like a big thing that UChicago really wants to push, because every undergraduate, every business school really wants to have some sort of entrepreneurship. That said, I think in that regard, fashion is also a very good way to mix and to really take advantage of this entrepreneurial spirit. We have this startup on campus, Vintage Campus, that makes all sorts of UChicago and kind of historic fashion apparel. And you've seen a lot of people leaving their jobs in banking and consulting and corporates, going over to open up some sort of some unique fashion company. And I think if students were involved once the entrepreneurship thing takes off at UChicago, being able to integrate the fashion aspect to show students that fashion is also practical besides creative and fun, it will probably draw a larger audience and probably grow further and get the attention of the administration even more.
Yeah, I feel like it could live in almost every department here. It could live in the School of Economics. It could live in the law school, like fashion, the study, or the study of fashion law and those areas. That's a huge business. I mean, people become legal counselors and whatnot within fashion companies, fashion industries. Where else? They study philosophy here too, right? I need to learn what we learn here. At least in my work here in the exhibitions, I would love to see more material culture and fashion incorporated into what we show. So, today with having the MODA exhibition opening downstairs in the Lower Gidwitz lobby, I think is the first step to getting people more comfortable with it, and then making these areas where we can communicate and commune, I think, about fashion here. I think.
And also, so the exhibition just made me sort of yearn for more collaboration between maybe MODA and DOVA. Sort of artistic.
That's a great idea.
Maybe some gallery shows would be interesting to see.
Definitely.
Like more collaboration between makers of all kinds.
Absolutely.
More of the more SAIC collaboration, I should say, too, because those are some of my
across the city
most energizing conversations have come along that axis. So, and yeah, not just SAIC, but that's a great model for how we can have more Chicago-wide conversations.
Fantastic question, Morgan. Thank you for that. And now that it's like 8:07, I think we all should go back downstairs and stare at all the fashions. But I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you to all the panelists. Wonderful conversation.